Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to take a look at the public mood regarding the rail strikes with a view to looking ahead to wider strikes in other sectors and whether Priti Patel's hardline approach with the police is likely to work or backfire. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So the country feels like it's a little bit of a tipping point here. What do we see on the front page of the Daily Mail this morning? Priti, arrest protest mob. This refers to the go slow protests on the motorways around the country that took place yesterday in response to the out of control fuel price rises. That we've seen over the past year or two. It reminds me a little of the fuel protests in the early days of the last Labour government, when I was much younger. There it was achieved by blockading refineries, if I remember correctly. So what happened then is you ended up with a shortage of petrol at the pumps. This time it was targeting space on the roads rather than fuel supplies. Some people have been arrested, nowhere near the full number of people taking part. And this headline in the Mail suggests that the Home Secretary is wanting police to take full advantage of their new police state power to crack down on any dissension. And as someone who grew up in a Yorkshire mining village in the 80s, this resonates. It immediately makes you think of the brutality of the police action against striking miners back then. Now, we haven't seen any of that, and I'm hoping we never do. But I wonder if Patel and maybe some other Tories are thinking the same thing. Because back then, from their point of view, they won. But it came at a terrible cost, and the situation is now very different. Like, if they are trying to provoke a similar situation, I think the government are likely to lose it this time. First of all, back then it created a long-term mistrust between the communities and the police. In order for the police to do their jobs, they need to be part of the community and seen as part of the community. Where police struggle, it's where they're not seen as part of that community. You know, if they're seen as little more than government-controlled bother boys, then the whole concept falls down. In countries where the police are used to aggressively stamp down on protest, the police force is huge, loads of officers. We don't have that many police in the UK. In fact, very famously, we have tens of thousands fewer police officers now than under Labour, and the population's got bigger. Put simply, the Tories simply don't have the numbers to crack down on us like that. The other thing to consider is that the miners' strikes and resultant community divisions took place in Labour areas and targeted a relatively small group of people. There was no major electoral risk for the Tories in destroying these communities as long as it was approved of by people safely out of harm's way in their voting areas. But the driving force behind the protests and strikes taking place now, as well as future ones planned, is something shared by ordinary voters across the country. So the price of fuel is out of control, and with a pound that's fallen in value against both the dollar and the euro, it's going to get more expensive still. According to the average price track on the RAC website, the cost of unleaded has gone up 45% in the last year and 72% compared to 2 years ago. Now, you consider someone who needs to drive a bit of distance to work. They might live in one town, work in another. Very common these days. They may have been struggling a couple of years ago, but they're getting by. 2 years later, with an income which will have hardly gone up, they're facing 72% higher fuel costs on top of much higher food and energy costs. Something's got to give. But would the protest be too disruptive for the public to get behind, even if they approve of the cause? That is always the big question. So then you take the rail strikes, because we've got a little data on this. As people who follow me will know, so I'm in favour of this strike action, given that the government have prevented a negotiated agreement, and given that this isn't a strike to try and get better paying conditions. This is a strike to stop people facing compulsory redundancies and to stop very poorly paid people taking what is in effect an 8% real terms pay cut. But the devil's in the detail. There's strike action and the strike action. You know, when you take part in a wide-ranging strike which will directly disrupt the general public, you have to get your PR right. What you want to do is minimise the disruption to the general public and maximise the disruption to the people whose minds you need to change. The government or the employers. And you look at it a couple of weeks later, and I would say, so far, so good. They may not get what they want. I don't know about that. We'll have to see how entrenched the government feel. But they are winning the PR battle at the moment. For a start, their union leader, Mick Lynch, did well in interviews. Notice how you're not seeing any more interviews with him at the moment. You know, it might be because the strikes are finished for now and they'll start up again, but it may well be that those media outlets were sick of failing to make him look bad. But public support has not been lost. That's the crucial thing. So as we built up to the strikes, I was keeping an eye on what polling I could. There was some polling done on YouGov on support for the strikes. In the first week of June, so before it was happening, 49% people have opposed it, 33% supported it. Then in the third week of June, just before the strike action started, the same poll showed 45% against, 37% in support. So support had increased as the RMT's campaign geared up. So that indicated that, okay, they're getting their pitch right, but what will happen after the strike? Now, as I say, that was before the action. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find an update on YouGov for the views after the strike. But I did notice that a week ago, after that first round of strikes, the Daily Mail was reporting that support had increased as well. They were citing a different polling company. So even if those who support it are potentially still outnumbered by those who oppose it, the point is that the action didn't cost public support, it strengthened it. Public support has increased, and that's in the early stages, and that's quite crucial. I think if the government wants to crack down hard on protests and maybe even strikes, they're going to struggle to win support. Because make no mistake, the reason the government are doing this is largely to divide the nation. I can believe that Priti Patel takes some personal pleasure in this sort of thing, but I think by and large this is strategic for the Conservatives. The Conservatives always win by playing us off against each other, divide and rule, the oldest political trick in the book. So far, we've seen poorly paid rail workers go on strike. Even more poorly paid criminal barristers, which comes as a surprise to everyone, are engaged on a rather longer term strike action plan. We've had non-union fuel protests, which are hardly like to go away. In the pipeline, we have potential strike action from, you name it, postal workers, teachers, NHS staff, more transport strikes, not just the rail workers again, but bus and airport workers. You know, you get the feeling that the government are putting all their eggs in one basket here, because the situation as I see it is they are aware they've got no record to defend for the next election. They can't stand on anything. Yes, they've convinced people they dealt with COVID well. It's a lie. The COVID inquiry is likely to make some people question that, but they seem to have gotten away with it for now at least. But people don't vote as a reward, but as an expectation of more to come. What are the government going to promise and what can they use to back it up? The Tories have got nothing. So all they can do is what right-wing political parties around the world always resort to, spreading fear of your neighbours. Fear and division is their only route to sustaining power now. But they usually do this by picking on minority groups who are not part of their natural voter base. You know, very often the unemployed. But look at what they're doing here. They're attacking lawyers, nurses, teachers, doctors, rail workers, airport staff, farm workers. In fact, I'm not sure there's a profession they haven't attacked yet. Maybe the police, even then. But they expect the police to fight the rest of us in order to further their culture wars. But the point is they're not picking on a small group of people miles away from their own voters, as they did in the 80s. They're attacking people who live in every community, who are a big part of every community, Labour and Conservative, Red Wall and Blue Wall. And if you go back before those isolated miners' strikes in the 80s to the rather wider ranging action in the 70s, in both cases the public turned on the government. In one case it was a Conservative government in place at the time, it wasn't at the next election. In the other case it was a Labour government, it wasn't at the next election. It doesn't matter the colour of your stripes, when the problem continues, if the government don't deal with it, ultimately the people expect the government to deal with it, and if they don't, they'll happily let in others to try and do better. Ordinarily, I'd be thinking that Tory strategists will be well aware of the hazard here and working on contingency plans if they continue to fail to get the public on their side. Something I think they will struggle to do because so many people can't manage. That's the crucial factor here. This is the problem for them. Yes, the public will support no end of stupid, bloody ideological battles when they're just about getting by. But when people are working hard and still can't pay the bills, Then they read that those bills are going to get even higher, but the government are doing nothing about it and telling them not to demand higher wages. At that point, you will struggle to persuade them to back your zealotry. So the government ought to be thinking of off-ramps to get out of this if they can't turn the tide. And I normally would expect Tories to excel in political strategy, but right now, we do seem to have a Conservative Party where the most senior ministers ignore experts, even their own. We may actually have a Conservative Party that is entirely led by the heart and has locked the head in their deepest, darkest dungeon. And I wonder how many of the current Tory MPs are aware that the public are not only siding against them, but history shows they'll turn on them in a big way if these problems are not dealt with. They may get away with blaming one group of people, especially those who tend not to vote Conservative anyway. They're going to struggle to win public support if they're attacking all of our essential workers. And if the Home Office attempts to ramp tensions up even further with over-the-top police action, they may be making the mistake of their lives. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships, and until next time, I'll see you later.